My name is Jared Towers. I'm with North Island Marine Mammal Stewardship Association and Vancouver Island North. When I'm not working for NMSA, I also work as a cetacean researcher for the Canadian government and the government of South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, mostly doing research on protected species at risk. And I'm also with the MERS Marine Education and Research Society as a director of research and response. But today, I'm representing NMSA and Vancouver Island North, and when I was putting this talk title together, The Cultural Importance of Cetaceans to Vancouver Island North, I realized that this can really go both ways. I mean, obviously, Vancouver Island North is also important to cetaceans, and hopefully, over the course of the next 15 minutes or so, that'll become apparent in my talk. So first off, Vancouver Island North is off the west coast of Canada. It actually encompasses the whole northern half of Vancouver Island. But most of the activity with whales and people takes place in a small part of this area, outlined in that box there, Blackfish Sound, Johnson Strait, Queen Charlotte Strait, Robson Bight. And in this area, there's a huge community connection to whales, not only orcas, but also humpbacks. There's a lot of small villages like Alert Bay, Port McNeill, Telegraph Cove, and the city of Campbell River. And whales can be seen from these villages and towns on a regular basis. Often from people's houses, and there's Google groups and telephone lines, and whenever whales are seen coming by, people call each other and let them know. But in addition to this, it also has a huge First Nations heritage, and First Nations people have been living in Vancouver Island North for thousands of years and have adopted killer whales in particular as family crests and totems, and their cultural connection to whales is represented through their art, such as totem poles. In Alert Bay in particular, where I live and where NMSA is based, you can see carvings of killer whales about every 100 meters or 200 meters down the road through totems and carvings on the fronts of people's houses. And these are also expressed in dance and song as well, inside the big house. But our connection to whales on Vancouver Island North has not always been so good. There's also a dark side to our history with these animals, much like in other places of the world. Not only were humpbacks captured on the west side of Vancouver Island, but killer whales in particular were targeted for captivity. And this was in the 60s and 70s, where hundreds of killer whales were caught. I think it was 50 were kept for aquariums and 12 died during capture. This is a look at where all the whales were caught for aquariums in the 60s and 70s. And only a few were actually caught around the North Island by Malcolm Island and Port Hardy. Most of them were down off of Washington and Victoria. In addition to the live capture industry, killer whales were also shot at on a regular basis, and it's unknown how many animals died because of this, but it was very common. A lot of the animals that were captured had bullet holes in them, and even some individuals like T21 here, she was alive up until about 2 years ago, and you could see that bullet hole in her back all the time. It was there from when she was a younger animal in the 60s or 70s or before. But what captivity allowed us was a perception shift. People realized that these animals were intelligent, they had strong social bonds, and unique connections to each other and to people. This is Dr. Paul Spong when he worked on researching the brains of captive orcas in the 1960s. And what Paul realized was that captivity was probably the most inhumane environment for these animals. And so he took his studies to the wild off of northern Vancouver Island on a place called Hansen Island and developed Orca Lab. And this is a picture I just took about 5 days ago, and you can actually see Orca Lab right behind the animal on the right, I-62 there. And so obviously a great place to study whales in the wild, and he's been there since 1970. This is a look at the remote network that Paul Spong and his wife Helena Simmons and all their volunteers over the years have developed. If you're online, you can listen to the whales live as they pass through northern Vancouver Island. And he's got 7 remote hydrophone networks as well as cameras in a lot of those areas as well. It was also in the early 1970s that the Canadian government decided to start doing research on wild whales. And it was Dr. Mike Bigg and Graham Ellis here who came up with photo identification technique for killer whales in 1972. And Mike was actually the first to publish on this, on cetaceans using photo identification as a research technique. And this all began off northern Vancouver Island. You can see all the unique markings on this individual, very generic looking animal, but those markings change very slowly over time, if at all. And through this kind of work, you can monitor a population and determine how big it is or how small it is. And as it turns out, the killer whale populations off northern Vancouver Island are quite small. This is a northern resident population, and this is a graph from a recent publication that we put together showing the population trend over the last 40 years. And you can see that this population in particular has recovered from all the live captures and shootings and any other pressures that they had back in the day through protection. And it's actually over doubled in size in the last 40 years to 290 individuals. And doing this research both acoustically and in the field with photographs and following animals around in the boat, it's found that there's a lot of patterns to their movements, including visiting an area called Robson Bight. And Robson Bight was an area that has a lot of good foraging habitat, but in addition to that, it's basically an untouched wilderness. There's a lot of beaches along the shoreline on Vancouver Island and Robson Bight. And this is probably the only area, or in fact it is the only area in the world where killer whales are known to rub their bodies on the beach for social purposes. There's nothing here that drives them to go up on shore for food. It seems to be strictly a pleasurable social behavior. And you'll see them visiting these beaches and rubbing their bodies in the shallow water on the rocks. And so for this reason, in the 1980s, this area was developed as an ecological reserve called the Michael Big or Robson Bight Ecological Reserve. And it's a protected sanctuary where no boats are allowed to go in. And it extends half a mile offshore and about 5 miles along the Vancouver Island shoreline. There's monitoring of this in the summer from an adjacent cliffside where BC Parks wardens will document all the vessel traffic in the area. And depending what they're doing, pass along the sites to the on-the-water warden, who will then approach vessels and say, you may or may not know, but you're in a protected area. Would you be willing to leave? And most of the time, the vessels go ahead and get outside the boundaries. So it was in the early 2000s, after the Species at Risk Act came into place in Canada, that critical habitat was defined for the northern resident killer whale population. And this habitat extends about 30 miles east of Robson Bight and about 20 miles to the west. And with this designation came a lot of other initiatives, conservation-based initiatives in the area. One was viewing guidelines and regulations, and this is a look at the brochure called the Be Whale-Wise brochure, which stipulates that all vessels should be no closer than 100 meters to whales of any kind and approach them from the side as opposed to front or behind, which is pretty typical all across the world. There's also funding for an on-the-water education program called Straight Watch. However, last year they weren't funded to be on the water, but there was for a little while. And they went around handing out these brochures and providing education to recreational vessels to ensure that they knew about the guidelines and the regulations. This is a look at some of the other work they were doing, monitoring incidents. And you can see that most of the incidents occurred from recreational vessels, which was why they were targeting those boats. But occasionally, even though whale watchers knew the guidelines, they were getting closer than 100 meters occasionally. Sometimes it's unavoidable, other times it's not. And for any vessels that had repeat incidents, those are passed along to the Canadian enforcement officers, who then have been known to fine companies or individuals up to $10,000 in recent years. This is another one of the programs we have on the North Island. It's an incident response program, as well as research with the MERS Marine Education and Research Society, and our vessel that we use for entanglement response and incident response. You can see some animals do get hit by vessels. It doesn't happen very often, but this is a look at the last few years of both entanglements and vessel strikes. And if you look at the graph, you can see that most of these happen with humpback whales. And for that reason, another one of the initiatives is see a blow, go slow, using this graphic. And this is only happening because the humpback population in the last 10 years or so has been increasing. Recovering from whaling, as it has in many parts of the world, is the same on Vancouver Island North right now. Every year we have many different humpbacks visit the area, but about 15 or 20 years ago, you'd be lucky if you saw one. So this is great news. These animals are coming here to do lunge feeding on herring, as well as trap feeding on the same species. They feed on krill occasionally, but most of the reason they're there is for the herring. And this has allowed us to do more conservation-based research, like develop energetic models for energetic requirements of these animals to see how important Vancouver Island North and that herring population is to these particular animals that visit that area. And by the looks of it, it's quite important. But really, when it comes down to it, Northern Vancouver Island is also very important for whale watching. It may actually be the place where commercial whale watching started. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in 1979, this vessel called the Geekemy began commercial whale watching tours. So it was definitely the first place in the Pacific Northwest where commercial whale watching activity occurred. And this vessel, the Geekemy, I was on about a week ago on a fundraiser. So it too is still doing the same thing 40 some odd years later. This is another one of the vessels called the 2N. It's been in operation since 1986. It's a boat that my parents own and run whale watching tours on. And it's also a great place to see whales from a kayak because we don't have ocean swells in the protected waters around Vancouver Island North. Most of the focus is on resident killer whales who eat fish. As I said, there's also humpback whales and stellar sea lions along with humpback whales. And there's also a whale interpretive center in Telegraph Cove. Telegraph Cove is a small spot on Vancouver Island, and they've got the skeletons of fin whales, minkies, almost every species of cetacean that you can find off northern Vancouver Island, as well as interactive displays with bones for people, as well as these two large blue whale lower jaw bones. There's also an Orca Fest in Port McNeill, one of the other small villages off northern Vancouver Island, where local nonprofits can provide educational material to the public. And Northern Vancouver Island is also the home to the northernmost whale trail. And the whale trail is an initiative of land-based trails that run from California all the way up to British Columbia in different sites along the way. And off Telegraph Cove is the furthest north whale trail. What we've done in the last couple of years is do a couple different studies on the economic value of tourism to the region. And as you can see in one study where we were looking at the value of tourism to provide more of an argument for why marine protected areas are so important, we found that in direct revenue, there's $12 to $16 million of tourism revenue off of Vancouver Island North each year, as well as 17,000 to 25,000 visitors come to go whale watching. And these are impressive numbers for Vancouver Island North because there's not a lot of people there. It's a place that's relatively hard to get to. But when you compare these numbers to what the whale watching industry off southern Vancouver Island makes and the number of people that they take whale watching every year, these numbers are really quite small. And this is actually just a look at the whale watching activity around Vancouver Island. And if you see the area off the south is about the same as the area off the north, including that there is critical habitat down there for a different population of killer whales called the southern residents. But in that area, because it's such a large urban center with places like Victoria, Seattle, and Vancouver all running whale watch tours, this is fairly typical on the water. Sometimes it's not uncommon to see over 100 boats around one pod of whales, whereas in other parts of Vancouver Island, you may see 3 or 4 on a busy day. One thing that we've done at NMSA in order to help prevent incidents is have a whale watch flag that all different members and people who are interested in whale watching can fly in the hopes to raise awareness to other boaters, mostly recreational vessels, that there are whales in the area and they should slow down in order to be more vigilant in their watch for whales and avoid them so as to avoid striking them or getting closer than 100 meters to them. And this is one of our members flying the whale watch flag next to an orca. And all these different initiatives and protection measures, protected areas, guidelines, they also not only affect endangered species or threatened species like the killer whales and humpbacks, but they also work great for the other animals that we have in the region. There's minke whales, of which we're also doing research on. The occasional fin whale comes into the area. Pacific white-sided dolphins, as you know, love to ride the bows of a lot of different boats. Same with the Dall's porpoises. And transient or bigs, marine mammal-eating killer whales that love to eat Dall's porpoises and other things. And we actually recently designated critical habitat for these animals as well, which includes northern Vancouver Island and a lot of other parts of British Columbia. And I think that's it. With that, I just want to summarize by saying the marine environment off Vancouver Island North is an important, in some cases critical habitat to several species of cetacean. Human heritage with cetaceans in this region dates back hundreds of years through First Nations culture and lineage. Since the 1970s, conservation-based cetacean science initiatives and commercial whale watching tours have been undertaken in this region. And since the 1980s, the designation, development, and protection of ecological reserves and critical habitats for cetaceans off Vancouver Island North has been ongoing. I just want to thank the sponsors and the individuals listed here, and thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now if there's time or later. Thank you.